with the shadows, right at the time, at the max, if you will, the shadows of the moon passing across the ground. Another person felt that the most memorable aspect of the whole thing was the drop in temperature, which I couldn't tell because I was in here. We were doing the program, and I missed that part. But I had more than one person make reference to that, so I'm sure that was significant for those people that were outside. And but it was really incredible, and we were. It never got totally dark here because we weren't right in the path of the Passover, but a number of people from this area traveled to either Nashville or to South Carolina because that was the path of the eclipse, and they wanted to get the full effect of it, the total effect of it, and I guess they did because many of them aren't back yet. But it's a topic of conversation, and it's not a bad thing, if that makes sense. I mean, here's people, engaged in something, all of them interested in it, and it's not bad. Nobody died, that kind of thing. It's really kind of interesting. I want to welcome you to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. As you know, of course, we begin 30 minutes later in our programming on Tuesdays, and we have for some time. And what I try to do usually is to get a little bit of that time back by not stopping for our regular break at the top of the hour. With only a half an hour till we get to the top of the hour, obviously, there's not really the need for the break. So we usually are able to go right through, which allows us to get back 5 or 6 minutes. Actually, about 8 or 9 minutes, because by the time we do the intros again and the phone number and the web address and all of that, it's usually 10 minutes. So that means that we capture a significant portion of the half hour we lose on Tuesdays by not stopping for the intermission, the break. So welcome, and again, we would love to hear from you. Agnes is in the studio today, and if you would like to call, we would love to hear from you. I know our listeners would like to hear from you as well. Our phone number hasn't changed. It's area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to email me one-on-one and share your thoughts that way, and if you trust me to get them on the air and represent you, I'll do the very best I can to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's WAObrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And again, I mentioned yesterday quite a bit about our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, and I know most people do, and the reason I mention that is I mentioned on the program yesterday, I have a student in my class, came up after class, and she was very, very apologetic for the fact that she wasn't on Facebook, and I was almost going to, give her an award or something, because it was really encouraging to find a young person that was not captured, addicted to Facebook, as it were. So now I feel a little bit guilty. I don't want to be the one that gets her into this. But anyway, I told her that you didn't need to have your own Facebook page in order to go to our site and look at the postings there. So again, if you are, most of you are, users of Facebook, then by all means, just go to the Facebook homepage, and in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be onto our Facebook page, and there are a number of postings there. And as I've mentioned over the last couple of programs, you'll note that some of the postings, the most recent postings, are related to the class I'm teaching. So I've flagged those by putting a title on them, which is West WVU Tech History 152, and that way the students in my class know that particular posting is for them in this class. But again, if you'd like to, in fact, yesterday in our first hour, I spent quite a bit of time on the class itself and on the posting that I put on there. One of the postings I put on there yesterday about the elements of the transition from medieval to modern Europe. I don't know that I'm going to continue that here on the Virtual Center because I really felt at the end like it was a little bit overkill, because I think First of all, we've done it here before. We've been through a lot of this material in the past because don't remember we've been on now for better than 4.5 years, and so in that time we've covered it an awful lot. And one of the things we did cover are the elements of the transition, and we've done so much with the emergence of capitalism and with the assumptions of capitalism and the economic impact of capitalism, the political impact of capitalism. And again, when we were dealing with Richard Sennett's material, we were dealing with the social impact of capitalism and the fact that the so-called new capitalism, that's Richard Sennett's term, which is displacing so many people from the workforce. And unlike creative destruction, which is the term in capitalism, which points to the ongoing process of some operations or businesses passing away, and new ones being created. It's a process of growth and expansion and adjustment and all the rest of it. This particular situation we're in now, basically driven by technology, is unlike those in the past because creative destruction's not happening. And what I mean is companies and businesses are being destroyed. Jobs are being lost. But unfortunately, they aren't being replaced. And the result is that many of the people being replaced in the job market are not able to move into the very high pressure skills competitive situations that are part of the new capitalism. So in effect, they were being rendered permanently unemployed. And that's causing a lot of people to have to make total career changes. And given the fact that because of the economy being the way it is, most of the jobs that are available are what we call social service jobs. And as such, they pay nothing near the jobs that these people lost. So it's having a dramatic, devastating effect on the quality of life for a lot of people. It's putting a lot of people on Medicare, on Medicaid rather. It's causing people some serious problems, and we've dealt with that. So I don't know that it's really worthwhile to pursue the historical issues involved in the transition from medieval to modern Europe. What I intend to get into a little bit in class tomorrow, by the way, in the morning, are other aspects of this particular transition. And these are the most difficult ones because these are the abstract ones, the philosophical ones. I want to get into the Enlightenment and I want to get into the Renaissance. And I want to explain the shift in priorities from medieval to Renaissance Europe. And what that means and how it plays into the whole transition that's going on in the economies and in politics with the emergence of nation states and all the rest of it. So, I'm kind of excited about it because I really do think it's interesting. More important than that even, I think it's valuable. Because one of the things that I've learned in the past is that a lot of people, young people, students, at least in my experience, really never understood this stuff. Our education, I'm not going to get into this aspect of our education system necessarily, but one of the negatives of our education system is that it's not open to or solicitous of questions and criticisms. We claim that it is. We claim that people learn from their mistakes. We claim that good things happen when people ask questions. And when we have groups of people together, that all of them ask questions and share ideas with each other, that's the way we all learn. Ideally, that's the truth. That's in fact a given. But realistically, that doesn't happen in most classes. I found in the past that students are very reluctant to own up to the things they don't understand. They wait and hope that finally we're going to start covering something that makes some sense. And that'll mean that once they understand now, they can revert back to what they didn't understand before and maybe clear it up or clarify it for themselves. People are very uncomfortable and very protective about their inability to understand. And so the fact of the matter is they don't learn things, in many things, that they don't understand because they don't let people know that they don't understand. And in an educational setting, in a classroom, the way I can find out about that is if I happen to put a test question on that, and then suddenly I get back these horrendous responses which reveal to me that a lot of people didn't understand any of this. But the problem is it's a little bit late then because the damage is already done. So, but the reason I'm kind of interested in Renaissance and medieval and the architecture, the art, the sculpture, etc., that characterize these periods is because I don't think a lot of people who take art history classes and music history classes and the rest of them really understand the significance. There's the old saying, and I know I've mentioned it several times here at the Virtual Center, that art is the window to the culture's soul. By looking at its art, you can look at the priorities and the givens and the hang-ups as well as the positives of a particular culture. And very honestly, try as it might, a culture finds it very difficult to hide from its own art, from its own creations, from its most creative people. And what characterizes a culture or a society's most creative people is their ability to capture the priorities of society in that art. Sometimes they're celebrating it. More often than not, they're criticizing it. And too frequently, when these things are covered in classes, and some, very honestly, too often they're not. But the fact of the matter is sometimes even when they are covered, these kinds of issues don't come out, don't surface. The degree to which the art reflects the priorities of a particular period, the assumptions of a particular period. And so that's what I want to do in class tomorrow. It's an 8 o'clock in the morning class, so it's, you kind of hope that people are going to be interested, but very honestly, it's sometimes very difficult for people to get interested in anything at 8 o'clock in the morning. So, but I'm going to do the best I can. What I'd like to do here today is revisit a little bit of what we did on our second hour yesterday, which is material, my own material. And this relates more specifically to the 18th century, to the founders. And I mentioned, I think I've mentioned more than once, but I'm playing around with something that I think more and more as I work on it, it's beginning to take shape. And I'm beginning to say this ultimately is shaping up as the book I've always wanted to write. And that's kind of what I was doing yesterday. I've been very fortunate over in recent years, since I retired in 2013. I've been very fortunate to have more than 40 articles published in our statewide newspaper here in West Virginia. And you might say, well, A, it's West Virginia, and B, it's a newspaper. So what is so great about being published in a newspaper? For me, it's an honor. And the reason I say that is because here in West Virginia, the Gazette, the Charleston Gazette, over the years has established itself not only as the premier newspaper in West Virginia, but one of the premier newspapers in the country. It's a high-quality operation. I've always knew that. I knew that before I even came to West Virginia. When I was in Virginia, in Richmond, for example, I would oftentimes run across references to articles that were published in the Charleston, West Virginia Gazette. So when I came here, I was very, very aware that the Gazette was not just any newspaper. It's a pretty high-class one as far as I'm concerned. There were two, up until a few years ago here in West Virginia, there were two newspapers, both of them housed in the same facility. The Gazette is the more liberal paper, which was published in the mornings. And the afternoon paper was the Gazette, was the Mail, the Charleston Daily Mail. And it tended to feature more conservative op-eds, more conservative articles by columnists, etc. And then obviously for financial reasons, because all newspapers are having financial issues today, the two merged. And so now we have, on Sunday, for example, it's a combined paper called the Charleston Gazette Mail. And the sum total is a mix of both conservative and progressive literature and op-ed pieces, etc. I've been very fortunate in that the bulk of the things that I've had that I've had published in the Gazette have been published in the Sunday edition, which kind of actually, basically maximizes circulation. And I felt very, very good about that. And I've always felt that to have something published in the Sunday paper may be just a little bit more important than one of the weekdays, if nothing else because the circulation is wider. But the fact of the matter is that doesn't really matter. But there have been more than 40 of them over the last 3.5 years. And most of them have been one or the other of two topics. They've either addressed the founding, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, elements from the period, the 18th century founding period that we've spent most of our time on here for obvious reasons at the Virtual Center. The other topic that I've really addressed quite frequently over this time is education, both education generally and higher education specifically. And one of the things I've really been thinking about is if I could find a way to pull all those articles together and organize them in some sort of a coherent way so that it would make some sense that they were grouped together, that would constitute a fairly substantive beginning, at least, to the publication of a book. So with that in mind, I started about 2 weeks ago to put together my ideas as to the kind of introductory essay which would not only provide an introductory overview of the founding people period, but would also bring into it the issue of education, more specifically the issues of civic education. As I've mentioned more than once here in our programs, it is not an accident that the title of this program is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Because the nature of our Constitution and the republic that comes out of it, the republic that it sustains, demands, because it is a republic, it demands mass participation of citizens. Consequently, the effectiveness and the strength of the republic is directly connected to the instruction, the quality of the participation of the people, of the citizens of this republic. And one of the things that has disturbed me over the months and years, especially over the last 8 months with the current administration, is the degree to which many of the policies, programs, and actions of the current administration seem to me to fly in the face of key elements that sustain our republic. And the fact that so many Americans have bought into this and are becoming active participants in supporting policies and activities which I see as potentially destructive of the republic itself, have led me to believe that this link between the nature of the republic that our founders gave us and the responsibilities of citizenship that it must have in order to be successful is a critical connection that nobody seems to be really addressing. A number of people in the past have paid lip service to it. People have always been talking about the fact that because we are a republic, or because we are a republic, a democratic republic, or whatever phrase they use, and they can be any one of several, because usually it's coming from people that really don't understand the details of the differences between these different forms of government enough to know exactly what is precisely correct and what is not. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. But a lot of times people will say that because our government needs and is based on participation of its citizens, that means that citizen participation is critical in our republic, in our political system. People have been saying that for years, but rarely do they ever pursue why. All through history, it seems to me, at least the history since I've been alive, has been one example after the other of young people, when this topic comes up, whether it's in school, whether it's outside the parameters of school, in social situations or whatever. When the conversation comes up about voting, and in the past the conversation oftentimes has come around to the fact that it's so hard to make a distinction between the Democrats and the Republicans because very honestly, oftentimes there's not much difference between them. For those of you who remember your American history, one of the classic examples of this was the progressive election of 1912 between Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. If you remember, the period was overtaken by the enthusiasm for progressive reform. Progressives were taking over in a number of states. The principal leader of this takeover on the state level was the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin, under Governor La Follette, Robert La Follette, was noted as America's premier progressive state. And Wisconsin seemed to be setting the tone for what other states wanted to do, the direction that other states felt that they had to go into. And then ultimately, when this progressive enthusiasm moved from the state level to the national level, Wisconsin's progressive actions, activities, policies, and programs became models for progressivism on the national level. And again, the major definition of progressivism, for purposes from what I'm saying right now, is that it involved a much more visible, much more active leadership role in society for government, both at the state level and ultimately, eventually at the national level. So the fact of the matter is, traditionally, our contests, our elections are between a Democrat and a Republican. In this case, the Democrat was Woodrow Wilson, the Republican was Taft. But the fact of the matter is that Theodore Roosevelt had bolted the Republican Party and had set up his own third party, the so-called Bull Moose or Progressive Party. And so when the election came, there were actually 3 viable candidates for the presidency in 1912. The reality is that Roosevelt got more votes than Taft, even though Taft was the mainstream Republican candidate. Wilson won the election. The thinking is that Wilson couldn't lose the election because the vote against him was split between the regular Republican Party, Taft's group, and the progressive wing of the Republican Party under Theodore Roosevelt. So the fact of the matter is Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson together polled probably 75 or 80% of the vote cast in the election of 1912. And of course, what that symbolizes is that the whole country was becoming progressive. But the reality is, and this has frustrated students, high school and college students for years, is if you look at that election, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between Roosevelt and Wilson because they were both progressives. They both bought into the same assumptions, and they both looked at government for the same kind of leadership on many of the same issues. So it looked like there was very little choice, really, between the two. The real choice was between one of those parties, and Taft. Because Taft was the leader of the spokesman for the mainstream conservative Republican Party, who refused to move in the direction of progressivism. Corporations, especially, tended to support Taft because progressives, whether it be Roosevelt's wing or the Democrats under Woodrow Wilson, progressives promised that if they won the election, they were going to begin to heavily regulate the behavior of corporations. That was something they both had in common. So naturally, corporate America did everything that it could do to block that, but it was unsuccessful. The country was so progressive in its leanings by that time. So the fact of the matter is, oftentimes there doesn't seem to be a dime's worth of difference, if you will, between the two parties. Well, the fact of the matter is, then that led many children, young people, through the years to ask the magic question. If there's so little difference between the parties and between the candidates, why should I vote? It doesn't matter who you vote for. And usually the answer that teachers would give to that question focused on, as a citizen, it's your responsibility to vote. You should vote because you're supposed to vote. You should vote because if you want to basically feel that you have a right to criticize what government is doing, your vote entitles you to be critical. Basically, the suggestion was, if you don't bother to vote, you don't have the right to have an opinion on how government is behaving or what it's doing or anything else. So young people were giving all of these rather empty reasons to vote. But the fact of the matter is, nobody really ever addressed the real issues. Well, that's one of the things I'm trying to do. Because the fact of the matter is, if you read the founders very carefully, it becomes very clear that participation in the political process is an essential part of the success of this republic. Because ideologically, philosophically, when you vote, you are casting your commitment to go along with the outcome of the election, whether you win or whether you lose. If you participate in the process, you are buying into the fairness of the process. You are legitimizing the vote. And you are basically saying, this is my input into political decision making in this state or in this nation. And so, in essence, philosophically and psychologically, you are counted as a supporter of the outcome of the election. When you cast your ballot, you're saying basically, I'm voting this way, but the mere fact that I'm voting suggests that I'm willing to live with the result, whether my guy wins or not. Government has to have that validation for its own right to govern. Government's legitimacy is based upon the fact that it can speak to the masses of people that expressed their commitment to the process on election day. It's not a mandate as far as one or the other candidates is concerned. But it suggests that the winning candidate has a responsibility to govern for everybody, to be, in other words, to represent the best interests of everybody. And people's willingness to go along with that is reflected in their ballot. So the fact of the matter is, who wins and who loses is not really the relevant issue. It seems to be. And in certain elections, it indeed is. I think we're seeing that now. This past fall's election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump really mattered as to who won and who lost. And I think we're seeing that more and more every single day. But oftentimes, the differences between the candidates and between the parties was rather insignificant. And the irony is, that's the strength of the system. That's the factor that forces both parties toward the center of the political spectrum. That's the process or the factor that makes it unlikely that the winner of an election will govern toward either one extreme or the other. They can't win. Because in a two-party this or that, either or electoral process that is really winner take all in terms of our states, the winner of a state gets all the electoral votes. The loser of a state gets none. The result is that the very fact that the elections are conducted that way means that by definition our politics takes government toward the center, towards more moderate positions on issues, toward a realization that whichever party wins the election, they have to take into serious consideration the fact that there are significant people who voted the other way. And these winners represent them also. We're seeing a situation now where the current office holder in the White House doesn't seem to recognize that. One of the major concerns and criticisms of President Trump's presidency, at least the first 7.5 months of it, 8 months of it, is that he's been much more focused on representing his base than on pursuing leadership policies and programs directed towards the best interests of all the people. On more than one occasion, he's made it quite clear that he doesn't see himself governing for Democrats at all. He really doesn't see a reason why Democrats ought to be considered in political decision-making at all. They lost the election. What makes that dangerous for our republic is that our republic was structured to prevent exactly this. Because what's happening is that decisions and policies tend to point in much more extreme directions than they would if those manufacturing that policy, designing that policy, recognized throughout that they represented all the people, not just a portion of them. If you believe you only support the people who elected you, then that, in your mind, seemingly gives you license to govern in one direction rather than the other. The result is you're driving the other further and further outside the mainstream. You are radicalizing a significant portion of our population because their voice isn't heard. You don't want to listen to it. You don't want to hear them. You don't want to include them. That's why this situation is so dangerous. It's so out of character for our two-party system and for the factors that enabled our nation to proceed on a moderate track for so long. Yes, if a Republican administration is in power, it tends to lean towards the right. And if the Democrats are in power, decision-making seems to lean toward the left. But never too far from the track. Never too far from the center. Because as long as you stay close to the center, you are governing for the majority of the American people, most of whom collect toward the center, most of whom are moderate. Yes, you're alienating extremists on either side because you're so moderate. But the fact of the matter is, you're serving the bulk of the people of the United States, and you're implementing a political process that is necessary to sustain the republic. In order for this to happen, it's become very clear that education plays a major role in educating our citizens for the responsibilities of intelligent, informed participation. Informed citizenry or an informed electorate usually means knowing what you need to know in order to function wisely, vote wisely, for example. But actually, informed even means something more than that. Informed means intelligent. Informed means psychologically feeling, believing that you are well equipped to exercise your responsibilities as a citizen. It's very clear, and this gets back to the program that we did yesterday, second hour. It's very clear to me that leading founders, Jefferson, Madison, Benjamin Rush, John Adams, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, etc., Alexander Hamilton. Those people, those leaders, all of them were very aware, A, that the Constitution had to be consistent with Republican government. It had to be a republic. Madison even said in Federalist number 39, if anybody can prove that this Constitution violates the substance of Republican government, then that Constitution ought not to be ratified. In effect, what he's saying is, I'll be the first one to stand up and say, let's not ratify it, because it violates the genius and the commitment of the American people to Republican government. Here is the kicker. Here's the thing that I think makes all of this so interesting and yet so challenging. Not only for us trying to understand it, but for them trying to implement it. They knew that in order for Republican government to work, people en masse had to participate in it. But every one of them was a product of his age, of the period, of the historical era in which he lived. Every one of them grew up in a society which was pretty much class-driven. Most of them were very comfortable with and supportive of the idea of class. The idea that certain people are better able to make better decisions than other people. That certain people are born and raised to govern. I've mentioned more than once because I think it's very, very interesting. It really makes reading the papers of John and Abigail Adams worthwhile. They believed that as parents, as influential political leaders in 18th century America, so heavily involved in the major decisions which produced independence and led to the creation of governments. Yesterday we were talking about this. It really says a lot that the political leaders in the state of North Carolina would contact John Adams in 1776 and ask him for his thoughts on the structure of a constitution. Because by January of 1776, it was beginning to look more and more like independence was a likelihood. That each of these states would be responsible for crafting its own constitution. The fact that people of North Carolina, leaders of North Carolina, would go to John Adams of Massachusetts to solicit his ideas on setting up a republic seems to me to say a lot about the prestige and the reputation that many of these people were able to develop during this period. Everybody knew who these people were. Adams and Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson and the rest. But they were all members of the period. They were all products of the period. They grew up in a society, in a system, where class was very important. Where who you were, who your parents were, who your grandparents were, how much land you owned, what political influence you had in the community, the taxes you paid, the financial stake you had in political decision making, your role in the church, where you sat on Sunday, which pew you sat in on Sunday. all of these things mattered. And all of these gentlemen were products of that world. They accepted the realities of class, the realities of position, the realities of responsibility. What makes reading John and Abigail Adams's papers and letters so informative and so valuable is the fact that so much of what they talked about was raising their children. It was very obvious that they believed, they didn't think about it, they didn't question it, they just assumed it, that they were raising their children to assume leadership positions in this newly independent nation. John Adams was absolutely positive that his son, John Quincy, was going to be president of the United States. And he raised him to successfully handle that responsibility. He wanted to make sure that John Quincy traveled, that John Quincy knew Europe, that he knew culture. He knew the leaders in various countries. He was very comfortable interacting with the leaders in the world. And therefore, he had the kind of cosmopolitan background that equipped him for a leadership position. When you're involved in creating a government and writing a constitution for a republic, and when you're living and functioning in a situation where all the people around you, not just a few, all the people around you expect that whatever kind of government we end up with is a republic. They all realized that republicanism required the participation of all citizens. But they also knew that everybody wasn't qualified or capable or informed enough to participate wisely in the same decisions. They knew that certain people were better able to make the big decisions than other people. So the question, the challenge, how do you create a republic that invites the participation of everybody and at the same time preserve the realities of responsibility, adjusting to capability, so that you get the right people in the right places, making major decisions in certain areas. The solution, and these people were well read. They read the Western philosophers. They read the Enlightenment thinkers. We talked in the past about James Madison getting his college education at Princeton, and the fact that John Witherspoon, prominent Presbyterian, Scotch philosopher, political philosopher, was the president of Princeton University. And not only did James Madison complete his undergraduate education in 3 years, but he stayed on at Princeton for another year, more than a year, to study graduate work in the areas of political philosophy. So basically, what we're confronting is a real conundrum or a real challenge for the founders. They went to Europe, to England, for the answer. In the very, very informative distinction and definition of representation. They bought into the idea that the vast majority of people, the masses, the people as a whole, would participate in the process by voting. But somehow, decision-making, policy-making, needed to be and remain the prerogative of the best qualified people, the best educated people. Those that Hamilton says on June 19th, that date, by the way, is June 19th, his 6-hour address at the Constitutional Convention. Hamilton referred to these people as the rich and the well-born. They are the ones that make the decisions. They are the ones that design policy. They are the ones that lead. So in order to fashion a republic that was work as it needed to work, it was necessary to educate the people to fulfill the political role that was reserved for them in this republic. To vote intelligently, to be informed, to vote the way that they were taught to vote. And the whole idea of educating the masses was to educate them at the basic level to fulfill this role of participation, never crossing into the area of policy making or decision making. The idea being that the best qualified people would make the decisions and serve as representatives of the people, spokesmen for the people. But their legitimacy was to be determined or defined by the participation of the people they represent in electing them, or even electing their opponents. They were to represent the entire constituency, not just the people who elected them. And so consequently, their approach to education mirrored the role that they expected the masses of the people to play in the republic that they were fashioning. This wasn't just the position of one particular founder. This was clearly the petition that most of them accepted. Consequently, you look at the detail of Jefferson's proposal for a general diffusion of knowledge, universal education to all children, males, boys, of course, not women, boys, for 3 years. During that 3-year period, your curriculum would be predominantly history. And the reason history was so important is because the curriculum would focus on the character traits, the qualities, the values, the virtuous behavior of the kind of people that you wanted to be models for the people that these masses of people would grow up to vote for and elect. In other words, education for the masses was training. Training in the qualities and character traits most necessary for effective representative performance in this republic. These 3 years, Jefferson believed, would be 3 years devoted to teaching young people the qualities they should respect and the behavior characteristics they should be frightened by and afraid of and avoid. And they would vote accordingly. And the implication was that the people running for office would stand before the people and try to demonstrate that they, rather than their opponent, best fulfilled the qualities and character aspects, traits that voters were looking for and that the republic needed. That these were people who would put aside their own self-interest and do what society and the people in it most needed and required and wanted. Montesquieu basically said that's the only way Republican government can work, is if the representatives knows the people and the needs of the people that elected them, and the people themselves know the representative well enough to voice their interests, their concerns, their criticisms, their desires, their hopes, their fears, and all of that. And that this constant back and forth interaction between representative and voter would ultimately create the kind of civic glue that would hold society together and move it forward. So in a sense, the degree and level and character of the education the masses were to receive was defined by the political role they were expected to play in society. The education system was not designed to challenge the status quo, but to make sure that it continued to work, even though the political framework or the political environment itself had changed with independence. On the national level, the result of this thinking, besides the state constitutions, on the national level, the reflection of this thinking was the Articles of Confederation. And the assumption was that the states had to be in control, that rather than the national government. That the Articles of Confederation did not create a national government over the states, over the people. The Articles of Confederation created a league of friendship among free and independent states. They were unified in those areas where unity seemed to be most important. But they were independent from federal control in all the areas that seemed to matter most, which primarily revolved around taxation and control. So consequently, the Articles of Confederation required that in order to get money, in order to raise money, or to have a budget that the national government would need to operate, the central government, Congress, would have to depend on the states for the revenue they needed to function. The assumption was that the only reason that the states would deliver revenue to Congress, to the central government, was if Congress was doing and following the best interests of the state, was really serving the interests of the states. But as we know, in Madison's Vices of the Political System, written a year before the Constitutional Convention, Madison made very clear that those who created the Articles of Confederation had had far too much faith in the virtue of the people in the states. And the result of this was that the Articles of Confederation were rapidly deteriorating into chaos. Debts weren't being paid. Obligations to foreign nations weren't being paid. Troops weren't being paid. The things that a nation had to do in order to become great weren't happening. And Madison concluded that the only way to rectify this was to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and replace it with a more national government, a consolidated government, which, as Robert Yates tells us in his minutes, in the privacy of the convention, these people were willing to say, when they thought they were operating in secret, that it may come to the point where this new Constitution would have to effectively annihilate state government totally in order to make sure that all power came from the top. Then the next challenge, of course, once that Constitution was drafted, was the challenge of selling it to the people of America, selling it to the states. They decided toward the end of the convention that they would have to violate the Articles of Confederation, which required all 13 states to support an amendment to the Articles. They knew they would never get all 13 states. Rhode Island wasn't even there. So they decided that 9 states would be adequate to ratify the Constitution. And then they set out in state after state after state to win that contest, to win that ratification struggle. And out of that, in New York, came the Federalist Papers. But the fact of the matter is, as we saw in yesterday's program, Jefferson wasn't the only person amongst the founders who saw education this way. John Adams did in 1776 when he responded to the North Carolina Provincial Congress with his thoughts on government. And he talked about the importance of catering to the people and the importance of trusting the people to choose the right people to be in the positions of influence and authority, the representatives. Benjamin Rush said effectively the same thing. The goal of mass education, Rush said, was to create little Republican machines. And then, of course, there's James Madison, whose thinking is clear not only from the speeches he delivered in support of the Constitution, but in the Federalist Papers he authored as well. And Madison talks about the fact, like Jefferson, that the key to preserving independence and freedom in America is to depend on the quality, character, and virtue of the people. As Madison says in Federalist number 39. It is not the virtue of the representatives we elect that will sustain the republic. It's the virtue of the people who choose them that will sustain the republic. So then the next question comes, how do you make that work? How do you make sure that the people will choose the right people? How do you make sure that the people will accept the role of participation but not power? There too, these people rely on education. And John Adams makes the point in his Thoughts on Government that once we appreciate the importance of the people's role in this, and the fact that it's their virtue in choosing good people to represent them, that is the determining factor in the success of the republic. Once Adams says we appreciate that, then we basically realize that whatever the cost to make it happen is money well spent. Wow. A danger. One of the dangers of this whole approach to education, I think, this is totally me now, the flaw, the fly in the ointment, whatever you want to call it, is the assumption that the training will work, that the education will stick, that the relationship between representatives and people will become operative as it is supposed to. The fact of the matter is, the weakness in the whole system, in the whole model, is that because of the limitations on the quality of education you've given the people, they are ill-equipped to respond positively should their leaders choose to lead them in a different direction. Let me qualify that or explain that, because this is really important, I think. The education system has been focused principally on teaching the masses, young people, the particular qualities and characteristics they should look for in their leaders. And once they find them, they should follow them. But all of that depends on the quality and sincerity of the leaders. But the fact of the matter is, if the leaders are primarily driven by their own self-interest, their own vanity, their own quest for wealth and power, their own narcissism, then in effect, they have the flexibility or the opportunity to lead people in the wrong direction. And the people are not well enough educated to spot it, to know it, to beware of it, and to do anything about it. In a sense, what we're saying is that this approach to education doesn't prepare the masses for the level of education, true participation, intelligent, informed behavior, civic education, citizen behavior would require. It doesn't adequately equip the people to be able to spot manipulators, narcissistic leaders. It renders the masses of the people vulnerable to fake news. Yes, they're supposed to be informed. But what if they're misinformed? What if they're lied to? What if they're duped? The fact of the matter is their education doesn't go far enough to enable them to protect themselves from this. Is this just abstract possibility and theory of this danger, or is it real? Well, we know that in 1786, in October, the French ambassador to the United States, Otto, in a secret communique to his supervisor, Comte de Vergennes, the French foreign minister, talked about what was happening in America in the move towards the restructuring of the Union from the Articles of Confederation to what becomes the Constitution. And in that letter, Otto tells Vergennes that the way the leaders of the Annapolis Convention, from which the call for the Constitutional Convention came, wrote the official minutes of the Annapolis Convention in such a way that the wealthy in society knew exactly what they were trying to do in manipulating the people into believing that reforming the Articles was not enough and that you had to revise the entire package. Otto makes references to circumlocutions and innuendos in the minutes, which makes it impossible for the average citizen to understand what's really going on. The people are being told one thing, but in effect, they are doing exactly the opposite. They are led to believe that the Constitution of the United States is designed to create a republic that they will continue to control, and that the representatives they elect are the servants of the people who vote for them. And the citizens go for it. They basically go for scrapping the Articles. They go for the convention. They fall for it. And what Otto is telling Vergennes is that this whole movement to the Constitution of the United States is fraudulent. It's an effort to bring unsuspecting citizens along to places they don't know they're going by the way they use language, by the rhetoric they used, by their ability to take advantage in the deficiencies in the quality of education the masses of the people have. By definition, they are vulnerable and susceptible to misinformation, to fake news. And instead of participating intelligently in some of the decisions they're going to have to make, they are the objects of persuasion, rhetoric, innuendo, misrepresentation, duplicity, fake news. What all of this suggests to me is that the final leg to the republic that these men left us, created for us, the legacy they entrusted to us, the final leg is the educational level which will enable the people of this country to effectively and adequately and responsibly participate in decision making, become active participators and contributors to the decisions that are being made, to the policies that are being drafted, and to the directions that this nation chooses to go. We are going to see tonight in Arizona, as we came on the air early this afternoon, the president was in flight to Arizona for a rally. The day after he delivered one of the most serious foreign policy addresses of his presidency on the war in Afghanistan. Nobody can criticize the address he gave last night as being insincere or insensitive to the nation and to the people of this nation, to our military and to our veterans. This was clearly an address drafted by other people than the President of the United States. He said many of the right things. He seemed presidential. He seemed serious. He addressed the leadership role that the United States has traditionally played in the world. If it didn't come about 8 months into his presidency, people would begin to believe that this might be the turnaround. This might be the point at which President Trump was really going to begin to act like a president. 24 hours later, he's going to a rally in Phoenix. He's going to be addressing his people. They're going to be wearing red Make America Great Again hats. They're going to be carrying signs. They're going to be chanting USA, USA. The question is, will the president throw them pieces of red meat, as he so often does in these rallies, as he invariably did in every speech he delivered in the election campaign last fall? He is not leading a movement that reflects insight, understanding, substantive information, and serious reflection. He's leading a populist movement that is basically being inflamed by infectious music, by chanting, by signs, by aggressiveness, with bigotry, hate, many of the things that have characterized these kinds of addresses before. I would suggest to you that in my mind, the degree to which President Trump's address last night to the nation on Afghanistan should be taken at its face value is not to be determined by what he said tonight. Rather, it should be determined by what he says in Arizona. I would like to believe that what he says in Arizona will reflect the seriousness and severity of what he said last night. But I don't have anything to indicate that it will. Past performance doesn't indicate that I need be too optimistic. If indeed what the president does in Arizona reflects his past performances rather than his presidential performance last night, then I can say that what we will be seeing will be an example of everything that I've tried to say over the last hour and 15 minutes. That it will reflect the fact that the American people are not being educated sufficiently to deal substantively and realistically with the realities of what's going on. Rather, we're going to see an example of thousands of people being manipulated, being herded, being duped, being misinformed, potentially being lied to. And they're going to love every minute of it. It is not the behavior of responsible citizens in a republic. It is the behavior of a mob. A behavior that is reminiscent of past mobs in Germany in the 30s, in Russia prior to 1917. That's how serious I believe our situation has become. That's why I believe that what we've been talking about and what we will continue to talk about, which is the founders and what they assumed and what they expected, what they believed, what they hoped for, has yet to be realized. What we are seeing is not what the founders hoped for or thought would ever happen. What we're seeing are the results of what did happen because of the deficiencies in the educational model that the founders left this nation. Throughout the history of this nation, throughout its efforts to deliver public education to the people of this nation, educational policymakers have been very consistent in not veering away from the class system that defined the nature of this educational model from the very beginning. I think there's no place better to go for an example of this than the person of Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson himself. Thomas Jefferson was a lead architect of this particular approach to education in a republic that he played such a major role in shaping. It's also important to note that after Jefferson left the presidency in 1808, he became the major mover, the major shaker in pulling together the pieces necessary to create the University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's University, a university which would bring in the best young minds in the state and ultimately in the country in order to be exposed to some of the best instructors and scholars in the country in order to get the caliber of education they would need to lead. It's very obvious that the educational objectives, the goals, the assumptions that Jefferson speaks to in what he writes and what he says in his speeches about the mission of the University of Virginia reflects not at all the general diffusion of knowledge bill that he had put together for the masses, for the children of the masses. He is basically looking at education on two different tracks. He is assuming that the leaders of the nation need to be educated one way. Their followers needed to be educated another way. And that with the exception of what he called the boy of best genius, the twain would never meet. Society would choose to extract the brightest minds from the masses and educate them at public expense, which would leave the masses devoid of the kinds of minds and the kinds of intelligence that it would take amongst their own people to enable them or encourage them to see the deficiencies of their own education. The boy of best genius idea, the model of competency that is inherent in this, is also a form of protection for society. It eliminates the brightest minds from the masses and leaves the rest of them more easily led, more easily governed, as Benjamin Rush said. What a story. I think it's incredible. I thank you for tuning in on this Tuesday and giving me an opportunity to share it with you. I think it's important. I hope that I was able to make it seem or realize just how important it is. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your continued support of this program, of the Head On Radio Network, Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and those folks as well. Please join us tomorrow at our regular time. I think I would like to do a little bit tomorrow with the issue of the Confederate monuments. That might be fun. It sure is timely. Thank you so very much for the Head On Radio Network and for the rest of our listeners. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other. And we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.